comes from 2 Samuel chapter 11, verses 1 through 15. In the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab with his officers and all of Israel with him. They ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah. But David remained at Jerusalem. It happened late one afternoon when David rose from his couch and was walking about on the roof of the king's house that he saw from the roof a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful. David sent someone to inquire about the woman. It was reported, "This is Bathsheba, daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite." So David sent messengers to get her, and she came to him, and he lay with her. Now she was purifying herself after her period. Then she returned to her house. The woman conceived, and she sent and told David, "I am pregnant." So David sent word to Joab, "Send me Uriah the Hittite." And Joab sent Uriah to David. When Uriah came to her, David asked how Joab and the people fared, and how the war was going. Then David said to Uriah, "Go down to your house and wash your feet." Uriah went out of the king's house, and there followed him a present from the king. But Uriah slept at the entrance of the king's house with all the servants of his lord, and did not go down to his house. When they told David Uriah did not go down to his house, David said to Uriah, "You have just come from a journey. Why did you not go down to your house?" And Uriah said to David, "The ark in Israel and Judah remain in booths, and my lord Joab and the servants of my lord are camping in the open field. Shall I then go to my house to eat and drink and to lie with my wife? As you live, and as your soul lives, I will not do such a thing." Then David said to Uriah, "Remain here today also, and tomorrow I will send you back." So Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day. On the next day, David invited him to eat and drink in his presence and made him drunk. And in the evening he went out to lie on his couch with the servants of his lord, but he did not go down to his house. In the morning David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it by the hand of Uriah. In the letter he wrote, "Set Uriah in the forefront of the hardest fighting, and then draw back from him, so that he may be struck down and die." The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. And you may be wondering why we're hearing about David today. One thing that we hear at Christmas time is we hear that Jesus actually is from the house of David. And David was a very important king in the history of Israel. So much so that it's surprising to see this is held as an important story of his life. I mean, can you imagine if after you died, the only thing they remember of you is when you made a really bad mistake? Not be a great thing to think about. But in the Old Testament books of 1st and 2nd Samuel, we hear about this man named David that became king. In the biblical narrative, David starts off as a young shepherd, born of a family by a father named Jesse. And he first gains fame as a musician, and later by killing Goliath. He becomes a favorite of King Saul and a close friend of Saul's son Jonathan. As David gets older, he continues to gain acclaim as a great military leader under King Saul. But soon enough, worried that David might usurp his authority and take his throne, Saul turns on David. And the biblical narrative is really cool because it shows us that Saul tried to kill David 4 different times. Now, the first time he sent David to do an impossible task with 200 men. He says, "Go and kill 200 men and come back." And he didn't expect David to succeed, and David did. The second time, David was playing for Saul in the palace, and Saul picked up his spear and threw it at David, and it hit the wall instead of hitting David. Saul was a little bit crazy. And after those 2 unsuccessful events, Saul sent his men after David, but David was warned by Jonathan and also warned by Michal, which was Saul's daughter, that Saul was after him, and so he escaped both of those times and hid away for several years. Well, soon enough, David was no longer the military commander of Saul's armies, and they started being defeated in battle. And soon Saul and Jonathan were killed. David is then anointed king of Judah, and he begins to consolidate his power. He defeats the remaining sons of Saul in battle after battle, and he takes control of all of Saul's kingdom. And when David conquers Jerusalem, he brings the Ark of the Covenant there and establishes a new combined kingdom uniting north and south, and which exceeds all that Saul was able to do during his short reign as king. Now, throughout the story of David in 1st and 2nd Samuel, what we hear is that God blesses David over and over again. It was Samuel, the prophet and kingmaker, who anoints David when he was a child. Samuel, as the story goes, was upset that Saul did not do all that he could do to celebrate God. And so Samuel was called by God to go find somebody else. And he anointed David even way before David ever took the kingdom. David, as I said before, was a talented musician. And that's the way he got into the palace. Saul suffered from terrible headaches and probably what we would probably call our bipolar episodes, the way that's kind of described. And the only thing that could ease his mind was having David play for him. And so this is kind of how God had a plan to get David into that palace. When David faces Goliath, as we probably learned in Sunday school when we were kids, David is able to be a good shot at the slingshot and was able to kill this giant and be able to forestall a great battle. In every episode where David faces danger, whether it's on the battlefield or whether it's facing Saul, God is there to protect him. And the public face of David is that of a great warrior, a leader who brings the 12 tribes back together, one who is blessed with many wives. So back then, if you were a king, what you did was that you married to unite kingdoms. So I think by the time that he finally meets or sees Bathsheba, he's already married to 4 different other wives who are consolidating his kingdom there. God has given him success in battle, in life, and in leadership. And in the Old Testament, people would measure your success and say, well, obviously God blesses you because of that. And there's no one in Israel's history up to that point who has had as many blessings as David does. If we remember the story of Israel, we know that Israel started off as a group of nomadic people under Abraham. And then they were enslaved by Egyptians. And then they were freed by Moses. And they moved from being conquerors of the promised land. And they were ruled by judges from each of the tribes. And finally they established a monarchy. And in 1 Samuel 8, we hear that the prophet Samuel, when he's asked by the elders to form a monarchy for the first time, and that's how Saul is chosen, he gives this ominous prophecy. He says, these will be the ways of a king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them to be his soldiers and farmers. He will take your daughters to be cooks and bakers. He will take your best land. He will take your best wine. He will take your slaves. And in that day you will cry out because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves. Samuel warns the people that if they move away from God's plan of leadership, which was through the judges, and move to a monarchy, they're just going to experience all this pain of people taking from them. Well, the prophecy came true under Saul, and it came true under David too, as we see. And David, at this point of the narrative, the biblical narrative, is at the height of his power. He's at the height of his blessing of God, so much so that I guess he feels like he doesn't have to go out to battle anymore. You know, John pick up on the fact that it's about the afternoon and he's just rising from his couch while his army is fighting. Man, some days I wish I could sleep until 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I have a 12-year-old. He sleeps until 12 o'clock or 1 o'clock. We hear the first part of the story of this choice that David makes. He's at the height of the blessing of God, but then he makes a choice that has a fateful repercussions for his sons and all of his kingdom. David gazes across Jerusalem from the top of his palace. He spies a woman bathing on the roof. He wants her, and he takes her. He sends out people to find out who this woman is. He discovers that she is married to one of his elite fighting force. The Hittites, the 30, they were like the Navy SEALs of his time. They were the elite soldiers. Joab was his nephew, but also the commander of his armies, and Uriah was one of these very elite soldiers who was a part of that. And you'd think that might give him some pause to say, maybe I shouldn't sleep with this man's wife, right? But no, as many with power have as demonstrated throughout history, they take what they want, and David was no exception. And so I want you to pay attention to that verb, take. What is it that Samuel said? Well, Samuel said that the kings are going to take things from you. And David is no different. He took this man's wife from him. In the story of David and Bathsheba, we discover that David takes what he wants. There's no love. There's no romance. Despite what Hollywood would like to show us. I don't know if you noticed this. Back in 1951, that's Gregory Peck and Susan Hayward, and this was a retelling of the David and Bathsheba story. Anybody ever watch this movie? Anybody remember it? It was a great romance. And the way that story was told was that Bathsheba was in a loveless marriage. The husband just wanted to fight all the time, and she would leave him, he would leave her alone, and she was just distraught and needed to have some love. And Gregory Peck is the great king who is lonely and needs to find love. And that's how a retelling of the story has changed our Bible. And not only that, but for 3,000 years, people would read this story and they'd say, oh, there's no way that the king can make a mistake like this. It's obviously Bathsheba's fault. She should have known that the king would gaze upon her nakedness and see her beautiful body. But nowhere in our Bible are those things ever said. In fact, there's a great silence when it comes to Bathsheba. The only thing she says in all of these chapters is to David, I am pregnant. Just think about that. There's no judgment, it just says, I'm pregnant. David seeks to control another human being here, but he can't control this woman's body or how it's going to have a baby. You know, in the era of the Me Too movement, where we are in our culture right now, there's nothing that can sugar this story of sexual violence. Bathsheba could not say no to a powerful man without thinking about the consequences to herself and for her husband. But you know what? The story is not about Bathsheba. It's about the choices that David makes. This story is about a downfall of a king because of his moral choices. He is blessed by God, he is successful in so much, and he throws it away for a moment of pleasure. But you know what? That's not even the greatest sin that he commits in this story, and that's the thing. He compounds it. David probably could have gotten away with having sex with the wife of one of his commanders, right? Until she became pregnant. David compounds his sin by attempting to hide it. And so the way he tries to hide it is he calls Uriah back from the battlefield and says, why don't you go to your house and sleep with your wife? Doesn't say it that many words, does he? But he says, go home, enjoy your time away from the battle. He does this so he can hide the paternity of the child. For 2 nights, David encourages Uriah to be with his wife. But that fails as Uriah proves to be more of a loyal warrior who will not have pleasure while his men suffer in the battlefield. David attempts to control Uriah, but he discovers that he does not have power over the choices of a loyal soldier. And when his plan to deceive Uriah doesn't work, David comes up with a new plan. He enlists the commander of the army, Joab, into the conspiracy. He sends a letter, and this is what gets me, is that he writes that letter, gives it to Uriah, says, give this to your commander. And you know what it says in the letter? Send Uriah out into the heat of the battle so that he's left all alone, and let him die. It's a plan for murder by the hand of an enemy. And you know what? It works. In the further continuance of the scripture today, we discover that Uriah is killed. But so are many other soldiers. You know, David wasn't counting on other soldiers to be killed. He just wanted Uriah to be left alone. But the movement of that infantry to go closer to the wall meant that a number of other soldiers were killed too. David cannot control the whims of a battle. And he not only causes the death of Uriah, but several of his loyal soldiers. And when Joab sends a messenger back saying, well, we lost many soldiers in that battle, but he adds at the end, but Uriah is dead, David, the now callous leader, says to Joab, well, don't be troubled, for the sword devours now one and then the other. David tries to turn his murder by proxy scheme into a mere fortune of war, as if the strategy were all about to win a battle and not about killing Uriah. And finally, as you finish chapter 11 of 2 Samuel, what you'll discover is that David adds insult to injury, and he takes Bathsheba as his wife to cover up the sexual liaison even further and to keep her quiet. Can you imagine how Bathsheba's probably feeling here? Her husband dies in a battle, and she probably doesn't know that David set all this stuff up. Now, if this were an episode of Game of Thrones, would you be that surprised? If this were a story of long ago British kings or about the British monarchy, would you be surprised? Probably not. And I would even argue that in our day and time, we might raise our eyebrows a little if this were an American president. We'd probably raise our eyebrows a little bit and make a comment that nobody's a saint. But what should this story say to us in our modern age? Well, I think for one, it seems that every 4 years we are like the people of Israel, and we cry out to the prophet Samuel, asking for a human king to lead us. And maybe this is a story that should remind us that there is no one that's greater than God in this world, and that our faith in powerful leaders cannot save us. No king, no president, no preacher, no teacher, no prophet can ever measure up to the greatness of God. We know that all of our human leaders are going to fail. But more than that, I think as Christians, we should continue to be shocked by this story of David. David is blessed by God. David brought back the ark to Jerusalem. David united the tribes. And how can one so blessed by God make such an enormous mistake? Does power really, truly, absolutely corrupt and turn us into creatures that corrupt God's blessings? And I think the simple answer is that we, as humans, when we become successful and comfortable in our lives, we are going to be faced with temptations and opportunities to push the moral boundaries. I had a friend of mine who I was in seminary with, and he was probably in his late 50s at the time, and he had been had finished off in the school system as a principal of a school down in Georgia. And he sat me down one day and he said, John, I want you to be careful as a preacher. And I said, well, why is that? And he said, well, there are a lot of people who are out there to get what they want from you, and they'll use whatever tricks they want to get to you. And I said to him, well, what do you mean? And he said, well, I was a principal of a school. And, I had this one school teacher come into my office. And, she came down with 3 of her buttons down on her front of her shirt because she was asking for a raise. And I said, well, what did you do about that? She said, I kicked that woman out of the school as fast as I could. But he said, but some of my colleagues wouldn't have had that level of moral authority. Great novels, movies, and even real life have shown us that success, power, fame, and wealth can change us. And there are men and women, maybe you've met some of them, who will cheat on their spouse, believing that there will be no consequences. And there are people who are given authority over money who soon discover they have very little oversight from anybody, and who take advantage of that situation and steal from their company or the government, or, as I've read recently, a Little League. There are people who discover that they have power over other human beings, and because of their wealth or status or position or authority, and who believe that they can control others and control what they say about them. And I think the Me Too movement has revealed a whole lot of people who've been pretty evil. And just this week we hear about CBS News, their executive yesterday, being outed for doing the same sort of thing. And I think the thing that we also realize as human beings is that sometimes people succeed at those schemes. And it's unfair. And it makes us angry to see corruption and grift and pain. And we cry out for justice. But like I tell my children, and maybe some of you have told your children the same thing, just because you can do something doesn't mean you should do something. How many of you have said that? The evil which we commit against others we call sin. The evil which we do that causes harm to others we call sin. The turning away from God we call sin. And David sinned. He had faith in his power and the illusion of control over other human beings. He turned away from his faith in the God that gave him his kingdom. It began as one choice on an afternoon, but cascaded into a cacophony of sin that had great consequences not only for him, but his children and his kingdom, his soldiers, and even a woman named Bathsheba. And maybe that's a lesson we need to hear today, that all of us have sinned and fallen short. Even the greatest men and women can fail and have fallen. And if the greatest can fall, well, so can we. And so maybe we need to ask questions of how we can face the temptation of sin. How do we handle the moral ambiguities that come up in our lives? How do we live in response to sin that we see others commit? And how do we live with ourselves after we sin against others? Now, these are some of the questions I'm not going to answer today because I don't have enough time. But these are answers that I will be bringing up over the next 3 weeks as we continue the story of David and his son Solomon, his son Absalom, and all the other characters that make this great story of King David. Amen. By the way, as I was trying to come up with a graphic for the front of our bulletin today, I had a really tough time. I had to turn Safe Search on my Google because too many crazy people put things out there about David and Bathsheba. So just be careful searching on the internet. Our final hymn today is from the Rising of the Sun. From the rising